I was living in a major city with my wife and son, and working a corporate job at a bank. Ever since my son was born, I wanted to move somewhere quieter, but it was too hard to leave my job. I had applied for a transfer every year for a long time, but nothing came up until my son was 11 years old. The scary thing about it was that when it happened really fast. From the time that we got the news, we had only 2 months to relocate. My son Michael was mad at first, as most kids would be, but he got over it. The transfer came with a promotion and a nice raise, so money was not a problem for the move. We were living in an apartment before, but we moved to a nice house in the suburbs. The place was perfect for our family, and the neighborhood seemed pretty good. It was a single-story ranch-style house with a 2-car garage and 3 bedrooms. The house also had a large basement that we were going to let Michael use as a playroom. The move took place during the summer vacation for Michael, so that was convenient because he wouldn't need to take any time off from school. He would also have some time to get settled in before starting. The neighborhood was very quiet, and it seemed that most people there were older and retired. But there was a family on our block with a boy around my son's age. We noticed him playing basketball by himself one day. Michael was in the car with me, and I saw that he noticed too. The kid looked lonely, playing all alone, so it seemed obvious that he and Michael should be friends. Later that week, I introduced myself to the people who lived in that house. They were very friendly and invited me inside to talk. I went in and texted my wife to come over. They brought me a drink, and we talked in the living room. When I mentioned that our sons should be friends, they seemed very excited. I'm sure they were hoping that another kid would move into the neighborhood. My wife couldn't come, but I was able to meet the boy. His name was Tyler, and he seemed shy at first. That's not uncommon for a kid meeting a grown-up, so it seemed fine. We set up a meeting between them, and it was going pretty well at first. Michael's pretty outgoing, very much the opposite of Tyler, but he hadn't made many friends yet. They started hanging out together often, mostly playing Nintendo in our basement or riding bikes around the neighborhood. It was good to see Michael making a new friend so quickly after the move, and I hoped it would help Tyler come out of his shell. Everything seemed to be going well, and I felt like we were settling into the new place nicely. After a few weeks, Michael seemed less enthusiastic about hanging out with Tyler. He didn't say much about it, just that he didn't want to play with him anymore. I asked if something had happened, but Michael didn't want to give any more details. I respected his choice and didn't press him for more information. Sometimes kids just grow apart or find different interests. I figured if there was a real issue, Michael would let me know. Meanwhile, Tyler still came around occasionally, but Michael would usually come up with an excuse to do something else. It seemed like a typical phase kids go through, and I didn't think much of it. Life went on as usual, and I did well at my new job, and as far as I knew, everything was fine. Then one afternoon, I came home from work to find some graffiti on the side of our house. It wasn't anything major, just some scribbles, but it was ugly. Our neighborhood was not the kind of place that had any kind of crime. There had not been a single instance of a robbery or anything since we had lived there, and it had been almost 5 months at that point. I had a suspicion it might have been Tyler, but I didn't want to jump to conclusions. The next day, I decided to clean it up and let it go. However, a few days later, I noticed some scratches near our back door lock. It looked like someone had tried to break in. I checked with Michael, and he hadn't seen anything unusual. That was when I was starting to get worried. I installed a security camera as a precaution, hoping it would deter any more incidents. A few nights later, I checked the camera feed on my phone and saw someone sneaking around our yard. It was hard to see, because he never came that close to the house. It looked like a younger boy, though, around Tyler and Michael's age. I watched the footage closely, and after that, I really thought it was Tyler. I brought it to his parents, but when they saw it, they were sure it wasn't him. In a way, I can't blame them for taking their son's side. With not much else to go on, I let it go. The only thing I could have done was call the cops, but without any definitive proof, I didn't think there was much use. However, that night, I was in our living room discussing the situation with my wife. Suddenly, Michael walked into the room looking nervous. He sat down on the couch next to me and said that he wanted to say why he broke off the friendship with Tyler. Michael told us a series of sick things that Tyler did while they were friends. He said that one day when they were playing in the woods, Tyler led him to a spot where there was a dead raccoon. He started playing with it with his bare hands and using it like a puppet. Michael was creeped out and ran away. He also told us that another time, when they were hanging out, Tyler pulled a knife on him. It was a kitchen knife that Michael didn't recognize, but Tyler had it hidden on him when he came over to our house. Tyler held it to Michael's neck and said that he wanted to know what it would feel like. That was the incident that really ended their friendship. When Michael ended things with him, he told us that Tyler said he would kill him if he told anybody. That was why he didn't say anything sooner. Things were much worse than I thought. It was starting to seem like Tyler was a full-on psycho. A few days after catching him on our security camera, I came home to find the back door ajar. My heart sank as I rushed inside. In the living room, I found Tyler, holding one of the small knives from our kitchen. He was standing a few feet away from Michael. Michael looked scared but unhurt. I moved quickly and told Tyler to drop the knife. As soon as he saw me, I could tell that Tyler was scared. He put the knife down and started laughing. It was really maniacal, but I think he was really trying to pretend he was joking. Maybe if we thought it was just a big joke, then he could escape consequences. I called the police and his parents while the two boys stood in our kitchen. Although I was on the phone, I never took my eyes off of Tyler. After that, his parents took the whole thing more seriously. I can't believe that they didn't know anything was going on with him, so they must have been ignoring it. We stayed in that neighborhood for just another 6 months, because Michael begged us to move. Honestly, I didn't take that much convincing, and I probably would have done it anyway. It was too scary having that kid around all the time. He had it out for our son, and I would never forgive myself if something happened. This is a story about some neighbors that I had at an apartment where I used to live. When I first got married, my wife's son and I lived with my wife's parents. Needless to say, we were looking for something else. Not that they were bad or anything, but any newly married couple would want their own space. We weren't looking to go far away, because the free babysitting was too good to pass up. My wife found a basement apartment posted online, and it was just under our limit for cost. There was actually a lot of space, so I was open to it, even though I don't like basements. It was a 2-bedroom with 2 bathrooms as well, and it was part of a newer looking house. We went over to look at it one day, and the landlord showed us around. He told us that there were 2 guys in the apartment on the main floor, and a young family on the second floor. None of them were around at the time, so we didn't get to meet any of them. Before the end of our tour, I looked to my wife, and I could see by the expression on her face that she wanted to take it. I agreed, so I made an offer to the landlord on the spot. Just like that, we had our new place. We moved in just a week later. It all happened so fast. Even though it was a new house, sound seemed to travel well. Right away, we could hear the footsteps of our neighbors upstairs. It wasn't that bad at first, but we always knew when they were home. It was a little over a week before I met them for the first time. I was coming home from work on a Friday, and I parked my car in the driveway at the side. There were 2 guys on the porch smoking and drinking a beer. I waved as soon as I got out of my car, and they shouted over to me, "Hey, what's up?" or something. I went over to introduce myself. Their names were Chad and Lewis, and they were around my age, early 20s. I didn't stay long, and after 5 minutes, I went downstairs to my place. I didn't see them much, and didn't even know how they knew each other. But one night, as I was about to head to bed, there was a lot of noise from upstairs. I could hear yelling, and it sounded like there was a fight going on. I didn't know what was happening for sure, but I thought I heard something smash on the floor upstairs. Then there was a thud that could have only been caused by a grown man falling to the ground. It went on for almost 10 minutes, and my wife and son were scared too. I was honestly about to call the police, but before I did, I saw a police car pull up to the house through the small window in our kitchen. My wife and son went into the other room while I stayed to check what was happening. I didn't go outside, but through the small window, I could see the police taking someone away. I knew it was one of the 2 guys who lived upstairs. I could only assume what had happened. Obviously there had been a fight, and one of them must have called the cops on the other. Right away, I knew we had a problem, but I wasn't ready to give up on our apartment just yet. The next day, while I was taking out the trash, I ran into Louis. He seemed timid, and he had a bandage on his arm. We talked for a few minutes, and I wasn't going to press him for details, but he opened up to me right away. He told me that Chad had attacked him with a knife, and he had to call the cops. It was shocking, but I didn't ask for more details. Within the week, Chad was back. I was surprised to see him, especially after what Louis had told me. Despite what happened that night, they were still living together. It didn't make much sense to me, but I kept my distance. I thought it was best to stay away from them as much as possible. A few days later, we started hearing loud arguments from upstairs again. One evening, the shouting escalated, and we heard crashes and thuds from above. It was just like the first time. My wife and I decided it was time to call the police ourselves. The officers arrived and went to our neighbor's place to check on the situation. This time, things had calmed down before the police arrived. When they talked to our neighbors, they said everything was fine. That night, the cops told me that they gave them a warning for the noise, but that they couldn't do anything more. This pattern of arguments and police visits continued a few more times, and we grew increasingly worried. The stress was starting to affect us, and we realized we couldn't stay in that apartment much longer. My wife was already looking for other places online, but there wasn't much else in our price range. Then one night, the noises and arguing started again. It had become almost normal for us, so we were almost able to ignore it. This time it was different, though. At around midnight, when our son was asleep, there was a knock on our door. I went over to the entrance to our place and looked up the stairs. I could see through the window that someone was standing there, but it just looked like a shadow. I didn't turn on the light as I inched up the stairs. When I got to the top, I could tell that it was Lewis, our upstairs neighbor. He was standing there shaking, and I could see blood dripping down his face. I was about to go down the stairs and call the cops, but just then he saw me. He started begging me to open the door, but there was no way. I ran back down and called the cops. Chad was arrested again, but like last time, he was back days later. After that night, we decided to talk to the landlord about the situation. When we explained what had been happening with Chad and Louie, and I could tell she was concerned, especially since police visits were becoming frequent. She knew some of it, but seemed surprised at how bad it had gotten. To my relief, she allowed us to break our lease without any penalties. We spent the next few days searching, and managed to find a small apartment in a much better neighborhood. We soon finalized the paperwork for our new apartment and began the move. It was a tremendous relief to be out of that place, because I have no idea where things would have gone with those neighbors of ours. When I was in my late teens, I was still living with my mom and stepdad. Even though I had a job, I stayed because I wanted to save money. However, my stepdad wanted me to move out as soon as I could afford to. We hadn't been getting along well for the last little while, so I think that had something to do with it. They gave me a few months to find something, and I was always searching online. Eventually, I found a small apartment that was in my price range. The place was on the second floor of an old 4-story building, and it didn't have an elevator, just creaky wooden stairs leading up to my place. The apartment itself was nothing fancy, just a basic setup with a tiny kitchen, a cramped living room, and a bedroom that barely fit a bed. I didn't mind the apartment, but the area was known to be one of the rougher parts of my town. I didn't know the area well, even though I grew up there, but I did know that it had a bad reputation. There was a lot of crime around there that you would hear about on the news. My mom helped me move in with some of my stuff from home, and then I was on my own. On my first night, I had my friends over to hang out and celebrate the move. I was the only one who had moved out, so I felt really mature and grown up. I didn't even have a couch yet, so we were all sitting on the hard wooden floor of my living room. That night, we heard some shouting from the people next door. My friends and I had some music on, but you could still hear them. I was thinking that it was going to be annoying if that went on all the time. On the 4th or 5th day, I met my next-door neighbor, Darren. He was a guy in his 40s, kind of rough around the edges. He was missing half his teeth and had one eye that always looked like it was squinting. He almost looked homeless, even though I knew that he wasn't. He lived with his girlfriend Sarah, who I had never met. I had already overheard them arguing loudly through the thin walls. It was the kind of yelling that made you uncomfortable, and I hoped to avoid them as much as possible. Eventually, I did meet Sarah, and she was a lot younger than Darren. I would guess that she was in her late 20s. Sarah was a heavier woman with many tattoos and short black hair. We only talked briefly once or twice, so I never got to know her. Despite my best efforts to ignore it all, the fighting continued. Sometimes it got really bad, but I never thought it was bad enough to call the cops. I never heard anything that sounded physical, nothing smashing or anything like that. It was just intense yelling and arguing with the occasional slamming door. But eventually, it just stopped. I realized it had been a while since I last heard Sarah's voice, or saw her around. I figured that they must have broken up, and she moved out. It didn't worry me or anything, because a breakup between those two would make perfect sense. I didn't know why it didn't happen sooner. About a month passed without any noise from Darren's apartment. It was a welcome change, and I started to relax a bit, I was enjoying the quiet. One evening, though, I heard shouting again, but this time it was different. The voice was unfamiliar, and I was sure it was not Sarah's. Feeling a bit worried, I listened closer. It sounded like Darren was arguing with someone else. I didn't want to get involved, but the walls were thin, and it was hard not to overhear. After a while, I heard the front door of his apartment slam open. I could hear someone stomp out into the hall, so I got up to check it out. I peered through the peephole and saw a younger woman leaving. I didn't recognize her. She looked upset. Her face was pale, and her eyes were red, like she had been crying. She rushed down the stairs and out of my sight. I could hear her footsteps echoing as she left the building. It left me feeling worried, but I tried to ignore it. I thought maybe it was just another bad breakup. That neighbor of mine gave me a bad feeling, though, and I was worried about what he might be up to. Later that night, I was startled by a knock on my door. When I opened it, 2 police officers were standing there. They asked if I knew Darren and if I had heard anything unusual. They mentioned that the woman who left earlier had accused Darren of some pretty serious things, criminal things. I told them what I knew, which wasn't a whole lot, just that I had seen her leave upset. The cops thanked me and went next door. A while later, they led Darren out in handcuffs. I was peering through the peephole as he went. It was a while before I got any real answers about what happened, but a few days later, I ran into our building manager while checking my mailbox. After talking to him for a while, he seemed agitated about the drama that Darren had brought to the building. I asked him if he knew what had happened, but he only said the police were investigating some allegations against him. He never came back to that apartment, and I got a new neighbor within several months. Eventually, the news came out that Darren had been charged with assault against the woman that I saw that night. That really made me wonder what was going on in that apartment before, when Sarah was around. Like I said, I never heard anything that could have sounded like assault, but that doesn't mean that it didn't happen. Ever since then, I wondered if I could have done more. It is too late for that now, though. What's done is done.